So today I'm really pleased to introduce a longtime colleague of mine, Chris Timmons, who is a professor in the Department of Economics at Duke University. Chris has been an environmental economist for many years, has worked on a number of important topics ranging from water resources to climate change to recreational fishing, fracking, and has worked quite a lot on real estate markets as well. And Chris, in his recent work, is focusing quite heavily on topics related to environmental justice. Our other speaker for today was going to be Kay Jowers from Duke's Nicholas Institute of Environmental Policy Solutions. She was unable to make it at the very last minute. So Chris has agreed to kind of cover the material that Kay was going to cover in the first half, and then we'll break for questions. And then he'll go on to cover the material he was going to cover in the second half. But I do want to mention that Kay is representing different disciplines that has a lot to say about the environmental justice issues. She has a law degree and also a PhD in sociology from UNC Chapel Hill. And so Chris and Kay are collaborators and working quite a lot on the empirical work that Chris will share with us in the second half. We will continue to talk about environmental justice in our meeting in 2 weeks, where we have two speakers working more on qualitative methods to study environmental justice issues. Those will be Danielle Purifoy at UNC Chapel Hill in the geography department, and David Griffith in anthropology at East Carolina. So that's in 2 weeks. So for today, the only logistical thing that I want to mention is that Chris will basically speak for 20 minutes and then take questions. If you have questions, please put them in the chat to Catherine Anardi, our host. And Catherine then in the question and answer section will call on you, and you can be unmuted and ask your question directly to Chris. If you're having technical issues or what have you, she can read the question on your behalf. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris. Take it away.
Great, thank you, Marty. And yeah, thank you for the invitation. And I know Kay was really disappointed not be able to get here today, but I'm going to do my best to cover the material that that she was going to talk about. And I guess I want to note that yeah, a lot of this is sort of outside of the economics discipline. So I come at this as sort of a learner in an interdisciplinary context in a lot of ways. And I've picked up quite a bit from sociology and law in particular, just from talking to Kay about these things. The plan, just to give you a sense of the overarching scope of what I'm going to talk about, the first half is going to be devoted primarily to an introduction to environmental justice. And I'll probably go through all of these things pretty quickly, just so that we can get through a lot. But feel free to pull me back in the slides later to ask particular questions. I'm going to go through the history and a little bit of background. Some of you may know some of this stuff already because a lot of it has to do with North Carolina history. So if you're here locally, you may have come across road markers and things that deal with some of the history of environmental justice. We'll then talk briefly about some of the methods and some of the important empirical questions, and sort of leave off the first half with sort of the kinds of questions in particular that economists focus on. And then the second half will come back and dive pretty deeply into one aspect of those, and that's the way that housing and where people choose to live interacts with environmental justice. And in my mind, that's sort of a primary route through which environmental injustices occur, is both through where people choose to live and how neighborhoods get affected by where we put pollution. And then I'm going to focus on one very specific component of that, which is a central part of my research right now, which is how housing discrimination factors in. I'll try to give you a glimpse into several of the projects we're working on there, but probably not much more than a glimpse, but happy to come back and talk about detail. Okay. So that's the overarching scope, so you kind of know where I'm going with this. I wanted to start off with the history because the history is very local. And if you're not aware of it, it's kind of, you can actually drive over towards Raleigh and see some of these things, although they're now super fun sites and things like that. But the history of the EJ movement is really tied to this one incident in North Carolina going back to 1978, where a company over in Raleigh, the Ward Transformer Company, a company that makes transformers, which in the past and less currently, but at points in time have been PCBs have been used to clean transformer equipment, very dangerous chemical. The company that was making and cleaning transformer equipment with PCBs, the Ward Transformer Company, didn't want to pay to dispose of the PCBs in the proper way. So they hired a trucking company to basically take this material and drive it around at night in North Carolina and spray it through a little hose out of the back of their truck. A little mechanism was set up along the dirt on the side of the road, okay, to dump this cheaply. They managed to do the spraying, to dump the 31,000 gallons of PCBs, and they did so along 210 miles of road in 14 counties here and around the triangle and extending outward. They were found out. They didn't do a very good job of covering their tracks, and there was a criminal prosecution against both the trucking company and the Ward Transformer Company. The Transformer Company is now a Superfund site over in Raleigh, not too far from Carter Finley, as I think. But they had to deal then with this contaminated soil. So PCBs do a lot of really bad things to the body, and having them on the sides of the roads, they were starting to work their way into communities and affecting people. So the state developed a plan for a landfill where they were going to take all of the dirt collected from these PCB contaminated roadsides and dump it. The landfill requirements were that it had to be relatively close by to where the dirt was contaminated, to where the spraying occurred. It had to be sufficiently isolated on a big plot of land, and not near heavily populated areas. So the two locations that the state came up with for this landfill and back in 1978 were one in Chatham County, not too far from where a lot of us are sitting right now. The other up in Warren County, close to the border with Virginia. And if you're driving from the Triangle up to DC, you basically go right past through Warren County and past the area where we're about to talk about the landfill being created. I-85 runs right through there. There were the site in Chatham County, importantly, was a publicly owned landfill. So the community, the city, the county, I guess, was the owner of that landfill. The site in Warren County was recently foreclosed private property. And this is a dimension on which we focus a lot when we think about why we have environmental injustice and inequities in the way a lot of pollution both gets emitted and where it gets dumped. So the Chatham County site had a lot of advantages. The main one physically being that it was clay lined, which keeps the PCBs out of the water table. And the water table is actually fairly far down below the landfill. Another feature of it, as I mentioned, was that it was publicly owned. But the third feature here that played a big role was this was in 1980, the race distribution in Chatham County. So it's primarily white county on the borders of the triangle, close to Chapel Hill, and the racial demographics reflected that. The Warren County site, which was actually close to this town called Chaco, which was an unincorporated town in Warren County, was on private land. It had a shallow water table, only 5 to 10 feet down below the surface, making it a very bad candidate. And the local residents didn't have, for the most part, city water. They were all relying on local groundwater. And here is the race distribution. So you can see very clearly that even within the more predominantly African-American county of Warren, Chaco was a particularly African-American town within that county. Okay, this is one of the more heavily African-American parts of the state of North Carolina at this point in time. So just for comparison, the entire state of North Carolina, Chatham, Warren, and Chaco in terms of race and income reflects something very similar there in terms of those in poverty, the orange wedges, and out of poverty, the blue parts of the circle. Okay, so without a lot of additional detail, I can tell you that the state, the Democratic governor at the time in particular, chose the Warren County site. A large part of this grew out of the fact that the publicly owned site in Chatham County allowed for the community to have a vote. And not surprisingly, the community there came and voted, we don't want the landfill. The Warren County site was owned by a particular individual who negotiated with the state directly there was no vote by Shako residents because it was not publicly owned and it was not an incorporated town. Representation here had a key element to play in where this ended up. So they ended up building the site in Warren County. It's not there now for reasons I'll come to in a minute. This was one of the first environmental social justice race-based protests that occurred in the US, one that got a lot of press. So here you can see these are people laying down in front of the first trucks, bringing in the PCBs to be dumped. This brought in a lot of interest from civil rights leaders, and we'll talk in a minute very briefly about who played roles in the environmental justice movement. But this was really one of the first protests to really raise awareness in the US about injustice on the environmental front. I don't think I have another slide about what ended up happening. The scientists told them at the time, this is going to fail. They built it anyway. By roughly 1990, it had failed and was found to be leaking into the water supply in the town of Shako. They had to dig the entire landfill out, and then they burned all of the soil on site, which was not great for the local residents either, and cost another several millions of dollars to do all that burning to get rid of the secondary problem created by the leaking landfill. So it's not there anymore, but the site where they did all of this, you can still go and see up in Warren County. Often in economics in particular, we talk a lot about what happens in terms of who moves in, who moves out when there is something like this put into place. I just went back and pulled out some demographics about Shako, the town of Shako, Warren County and NC in general, with respect to percent Black, to see what happened between 1980 and 1990, which was sort of when all of this went down, when they built the landfill, when they realized it was leaking. And you can see that relative to both the county they were in and the rest of the state, that town became a higher percentage African-American. Okay, I don't have statistical bounds on these measures or anything like that. It's just a simple summary stat. But here we would talk about this as being a sorting response in sort of a residential type Tibu sorting model to get into the economics of it. Okay, so that is going to be the background. I'm going to tie that to where we are today in a few minutes, and that'll be kind of the essence of a lot of what I talk about in the first part of the talk today. But I want to pause now to just give you a sense of then what do we mean by environmental justice or environmental injustice or environmental discrimination. There's a number of terms that kind of get thrown around but mean the same, similar things in the literature with some subtle differences. A lot of what we're talking about when we talk about environmental injustice is simply disproportionate burden. Okay, so and disproportionate burden can be imposed upon people at a disadvantage, and that disadvantage doesn't have to necessarily be defined by race, although it often is in the literature and what we've studied. It can also be defined by income, and you go to other countries in the world that have very small communities of color within those countries, and a lot of what we're talking about there in terms of environmental injustice is based on income. For instance, I do some of this work in the UK, and there often it's based on religion. So you go to places in Scotland and Protestant versus Catholic is the main division rather than Black versus white. Although there are now communities there of color that are starting to also become disadvantaged. So I just want to kind of make that clear that this should be considered in a pretty broad array of potential disadvantages. We're going to focus mostly on race though. This is the definition that the Environmental Protection Agency uses, and I won't make you read all of it. I've underlined two parts, and I point out those two parts because they identify what I think of as being the two key types of justice. Now, you'll hear a lot of discussion about types of justice have proliferated, I think, in this literature. So there's energy justice, and there's food justice, and there's you can kind of go on and on. There's climate justice. You can go on and on a variety of different dimensions, but you kind of go down to the base level and we talk about procedural and distributive justice. And I feel like there's probably a few others that people would tell me I'm leaving out at the basic level. But the most basic level I think of as being, do you have a seat at the table, meaningful involvement, and do you end up then bearing disproportionate burden, disproportionate share? those two things are important from an economics point of view because the distributive justice component is kind of the key thing we look at, and the procedural justice component in an environmental economics sense fits into what we normally talk about in the context of the Coase theorem. And some people will get what I'm getting at there, and others may not if you don't study a lot of economics, and that's not that important specifically, but the ability to bargain is key in a lot of what economists assume about the way markets work. And if you don't have a seat at the table, a lot of economic theory breaks down. And that's going to come in later when we talk about discrimination, because that's sort of a failure of a market to work the way we hope it would. There's a few other definitions out there. I don't like to just focus on the EPA. Benjamin Chavez was the director of the Commission for Racial Justice at the United Church of Christ, which interestingly was the organization that wrote the first national study of environmental justice. We usually think about papers coming out in big name economics journals. Here it was a report by a church, a big church. But that's important because the civil rights movement was largely based in churches. Churches played a huge role, and they continue to in the environmental justice. I'm sorry, the civil rights movement was largely based in churches. And now the environmental justice movement was too. I like Chavez's definition because it actually focuses on things like discrimination and deliberate targeting, which the EPA doesn't really get at. Third definition I'll throw out there is one from outside the US. This is the Brazilian Network for Environmental Justice, and it comes from their 2001 Declaration of Principles. And I like this one in particular because it points out social and economic mechanisms that channel environmental damage. And a lot of what we talk about when we talk about environmental justice is actually systematic things, or systemic racism pops up, which is the kind of racism that doesn't have to be direct. It doesn't have to be the kind of discrimination I'm going to talk about at the end of the session today. It can be things that are built into the system, okay, that we may have forgotten are even there, or maybe when they were built, we didn't think they were going to have the implications that they have today. So I'll talk about some of that in the historical context of housing discrimination in the US, although many of those historical things, I think people knew pretty well what they were doing when they put them in place. Some of them maybe less so, okay? But systemic racism is a big part of what we talk about in environmental justice. Okay, very, very briefly on the history of the movement. The Warren County episode was largely considered to be the beginning, although if you go back in time, a lot of people view the march where Martin Luther King was killed while he was in Memphis for a sanitation workers march as actually being an environmental justice protest in a lot of ways. It had the exact same elements to it. So I throw that in here in addition to pointing out the fact that the civil rights movement was, in a way, they often describe this as tributaries into a bigger river. The civil rights movement was a fairly big tributary into the environmental justice river in that it provided a lot of the leadership. The people who had sort of honed their skills in the civil rights movement now took them over to the environmental justice side in the 80s. A number of people were in Congress or in positions of leadership because of the civil rights movement. They were there to push for legislation. Okay, and we see some of that come down the road. The anti-toxics movement, so thinking about Rachel Carson and everything that came after her work, also played a big role. And this is because the EJ movement is largely focused on things besides ecosystems and greenhouse gases. A lot of what they think about, a lot of what they talk about is actually more localized pollution, things that get into the air and the water and cause cancer and cause other diseases, lead poisoning in water and in the way houses are constructed, things like that. So that plays another major role. And we see a lot of this happening in the anti-toxics movement right around the same time as Warren County. So there's a little bit of a coming together here between Love Canal, the CERCLA Act, and Right to Know Act in the middle of the 1980s playing into this. EJ has a somewhat fraught relationship with the mainstream environmental movement, and this is something I didn't know a lot about until I started to work in this area. But there are a variety of letters written from environmental justice groups, and environmental justice groups, for the most part, are local. They are regional at best in terms of a Southeast network or the We Act is a large group in New York City, and they now do some work more broadly in New York, but they're very localized within that state. Those groups throughout the late 80s and early 1990s wrote series of letters basically condemning mainstream environmentalism, and they would refer to the group of 10, which is the list of groups you see here, many of which we know quite a bit about, as being responsible for a lot of the problems that they face, or at least not contributing, and in some cases actively working against solving the problems faced by people in these communities. The differences they point out were often in terms of membership. The membership in those groups is often very white, and still is to a large extent, whereas these environmental justice groups were much stronger communities of color. The scope of what they were looking at tended to be a difference between natural landscape and endangered species versus urban landscape and health. And they received responses from some of these groups often that health from pollution was not an environmental problem, it was a medical problem, for lack of a better way to put it. It was more of a pure health thing and not an environmental problem. And then their purpose, whether it was more preservation or equity. And you see a lot of division along these dimensions. So these divisions have gone away to a large extent. Well, not, they've gone away a lot relative to what they had been at that time. Groups have started to build environmental justice units within their organizations, but sometimes that's a little more active than in other cases. Sometimes it's a bit of a more real effort, and sometimes it seems to be a little less so. I'll skip the early academic research and just jump to the fact that the government eventually did get involved here. So after papers written in the 1980s, we see EPA starts to get involved. They write a report about equity that creates the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice. That leads to Bill Clinton's Executive Order 12898. Okay, here's Bill Clinton signing his Executive Order 12898, and it basically said that the federal government had to do what I have underlined here, not make environmental justice worse and the environmental effects and their disproportionate impacts worse through what they do. Okay, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail after what the federal government did in Executive Order 12898, but it's generally not good. The EPA does not have a great track record in enforcing this executive order. Some presidents have done a better job of it than others, but in general, the EPA as a whole has not processed complaints very well, certainly not in a very equitable manner. It's sort of just a long discussion of ineptitude, I guess, in the Office of Environmental Justice at the EPA. Maybe things will get better, although it's just not a huge priority from what you can see. Okay, so last bit, and then I'll stop and take some questions, is to get into sort of what are the big picture questions that environmental justice looks at, and what are the methods, some key methods, and some key empirical questions that they care about. The first one that the literature focused on was the question of, I just call it the exposure question. Who was exposed to what? Right. This is the question of, is there a disproportionate exposure for disadvantaged groups? How do we define disadvantaged? Here's one picture I like to throw in. This is just from a paper that I worked on with Brooks Depro, who's had been at RTI. He's now a professor over at Elon, where we looked at cancer risk in Los Angeles. And the reason I like to show these pictures is because the first picture here, this is the National Air Toxics Assessment. So it's basically, what's your risk of getting cancer if you were to live your life out in any census tract in Los Angeles? Here's the percentage of Hispanic Latinx residents in all those census tracts, and here's the percentage of white residents. And if you just kind of, blur your eyes a little bit so you can't see the titles, the first two maps basically look the same. There's maybe a slightly darker area over here in East LA when you are talking about the percent Hispanic Latinx, but basically we're looking at the same picture. And then you go over to the percent white, and it's the inverse image. Okay, this is about as stark of a picture of disparate exposure as I can find in 3 simple maps. But it's not hard to find pictures like this with other pollutants, with other groups in different parts of the country. So was this ever a debate? Surprisingly, I think yes, it was a debate for a while. There was a lot of discussion about whether we should be talking about race or class. And when we talk about class, we're basically talking about income, but income can be a bad measure of economic opportunity. It varies a lot from year to year. So education and wealth and things like that can oftentimes proxy better for what we think of as class, okay? The way I think about these problems is that if I run a model with race in it and I find disproportionate exposure, and then I put income, wealth, education, things like that in, and the race goes away, it doesn't make me feel much better about the way the world is working. For some researchers and some people, they'll argue that, okay, if it's all based on income, that's fine because income is something that you try to earn, you work your way up in the world, the bootstrap theory. I think what I've sort of decided through a lot of the work I've been doing is that systemic racism can be responsible for a lot of problems on the class side too. Okay, there's a lot of reasons why the color of your skin can affect your income and your wealth, and these things work together, okay? Where discrepancies have arisen, and there have been discrepancies, there's some papers out there that fail to find evidence, they tend to operate along one of these two dimensions, okay? One can be in terms of the spatial unit that you look at, and this gets into the real technical nitty-gritty. And I have two things I'll mention in terms of the spatial unit. One is the ecological fallacy. The other is what we talk about as unit hazard coincidence. The other potential problem arises with how you define what the nuisance actually is, okay? So the early literature and literature today tends to talk about bad things as being things that are close to you. So here's something problematic, possibly dangerous, maybe ugly, maybe smells bad, and are you close to it? That ignores possibly how toxic it is and how much of that toxicity gets into your system. So a large part of this literature has been built up by people who work with epidemiologists and toxicologists and bridge the gap between sociology or economics and the med school side of things to ask about how dangerous is that pollution really. And I think that part of the literature is really, I think that this is a big advance in the literature, and there's a lot of really important papers there that cover that. I'm going to just talk briefly about ecological fallacy with some maps or with some pictures to give you a sense of what it is if you haven't seen that or heard of it already. Let me just mention unit hazard coincidence because I don't have a picture I'm going to show for that. It's simply the idea that if I define the proximity to a pollutant as being in the same unit as that pollutant, like I live in the same census tract as a landfill, that can lead to problems. Okay, really what we want to do is go down to the GIS lab at our university, draw a map and put all of the houses on the map with all the people living in those houses, with all of their races and all of their incomes, put a dot on the map where the landfill is, and then draw a circle around it, which is going to cut through the boundaries of lots of census tracts, but give us a much better measure of proximity if that's all we're interested in. You run into problems with unit hazard coincidence in cities where census tracts are small because people in other census tracts get exposed to the pollution. You run into the opposite problem in rural areas because census tracts can be enormous. Just go look at a map of Wyoming and check out a census tract there. The people in that census tract may never come within 10, 20 miles of that nuisance, except maybe once a month or, because it's so far away in that giant census tract, okay? So you get the opposite problems based on whether you're using unit hazard coincidence in a city versus using it in a rural setting. I will say when I let my students do term papers for my class on EJ questions, I let them do unit hazard coincidence because I don't want to go force them to learn how to use ArcGIS in the span of a week or two. But at the end, we oftentimes get screwy looking results, and I ask them to think a little bit about kind of, how that could mess things up. But I have a sense that happens a lot. Here's ecological fallacy in two quick graphs that I think I get the idea across relatively quickly. Ecological fallacy refers to the notion that the size of the definition of geography that you use can affect the result that you get. And most of the discrepancies that we see in the literature leading up to the mid 90s, when we were looking at a lot of exposure problems, tended to, I think, arise from the ecological fallacy. So what I have here is a checkerboard. And the checkerboard is as simple as we can get in terms of having minority neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. And the yellow boxes are going to be pollution sources. So you can see the way that I've drawn out my little hypothetical world here. This is about as disproportionately exposed as the neighborhoods of color here could possibly be, right? All of the pollution sources are in those neighborhoods of color. So if we built an index and said, index of inequality, it would be really, really high. If then, instead of using the boxes, the little boxes, as my definitions of geography, I use the bigger black boxes here. You may think of going like from census tracts to counties. Now, all of a sudden, I have the exact same number of white and people of color in every county, and I have the exact same level of pollution in every county. Here, the inequality index would basically go to 0, right? Same picture, just different definition of geography. So we see this a lot. Here, what I've got is actual data for air toxics in the US. And what we have is the county bars, this is exposure. For the counties are the black bars and the tracts are the white bars. So when we look at counties, what we see are white and black residents both have about equal amounts of exposure if they're high income. And they both have the highest level of exposure. And that's because counties that have high exposure are urban counties. Doesn't really matter if you're white or black. If you're in an urban county, you're probably higher income than rural people and you're more exposed. Okay. So if we looked at that, we'd say RISI, air toxic pollution. We'll get into RISI a little bit later. We'd say air toxics are not disproportionately exposed. But then what happens if we go to tracts? So we say within a county, people can sort. We see massively higher exposure for blacks than for whites, and higher exposure at the lower end of the distribution for both. Okay. So low, well, I guess actually for low income whites, we end up with even lower exposure, I guess, than for high income whites. Okay. So these are correlations between race and pollution levels. So the story really jumps out at you when we look at low and middle income blacks in the census tract definition. Okay.
Hey, Chris, we need to move on to the
okay, cool. So we're actually at the end of my first section, which means I'm probably going to run short in my second section because that was the longer one. But what I'm going to talk about next is going to be how we get to these disproportionate exposures, and that will be the topic for after the questions.
Okay, great. We have a couple really interesting questions, and just a reminder to everybody, if you'd like to unmute yourself to ask the question, let me give you permissions to do that. Okay, let's start with Jonice Pipkin. Jonice, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, I can. Hi, everybody. I was just kind of curious to see if there had been any documentation of environmental injustice issues that have affected different communities ever transitioned from being racially focused to maybe something related to affluence or either religion, like you had touched on in other countries around the world. And so that was my question.
So yeah, is there work that focuses on those other dimensions of disadvantage or dimensions of difference, or specifically what are those differences, I guess? Is that what you're asking? I just want to make sure I get the question right.
Yeah, I wanted to know if it had ever evolved. And so maybe it was racially focused, and then maybe like, for instance,
Yeah. I think especially as the topics have started to move out of the US, I think outside the US, you run into other dimensions. And that's where you start to see a lot of these questions get addressed more directly. So the work in the UK that I've seen has, like, that's one of the first places where I saw it based on religion, because religion is a big definer of class in parts of the UK. But they're actually starting to look at conditions surrounding South Asian communities in places like Glasgow. It's not strictly just the fact that Catholic communities in Glasgow live on the east side, where the pollution has always historically been worse. You go to other countries in the developing world and you see quite a bit of work being done now, and they're the topic, the definitions of who is disadvantaged. I mean, the difference in disadvantage versus advantage can be even wider, and oftentimes based on race, but sometimes based on other measures of class or caste structure or other kinds of features within society. In the US, this has progressed beyond just race. You can see now work being done dealing with gender and dealing with disability of various kinds. There's a lot of different ways in which people can be disadvantaged. So I'll show you some specific studies in a minute when we get into the housing discussion in particular, and some of those work their way off into these other dimensions, and maybe I'll try to remember and point some of those out.
Awesome, thank you.
Hi, Brad, Megan, and Reed. I'm going to skip over yours for now. Lynn, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sure. This has been very enlightening, but my question is, I am the Geologic Hazards Coordinator for the National Forest System, and the National Landslide Preparedness Act just passed, and we're going to be working on a national strategy. So what are some recommendations you would have that we could include in the national strategy to address environmental justice?
So I'm trying to think what so you said landslides in particular?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
As you look around the country, a lot of the exposure that we see is actually based on people who are living in places that were viewed as suboptimal a long time ago. I'm more familiar with this in the South, where probably landslides are maybe not the most important of the natural disasters, but we're actually looking at flooding a lot in this context, where people are forced or offered land to live in maybe 100 years ago, maybe longer. Those communities build up in places that are then more exposed to potential problems. We see this with wildfires, and there's been work done on wildfires and EJ that looks at this specific question out west. In the South, you see a lot of this with the places that flood are communities that were given over to African-American residents after slavery, when communities were formed, when land was doled out. And the land that they were given was the land that had problems, right? I mean, this was Jim Crow South. They weren't offered the land that didn't flood. They weren't offered the land that didn't have problems with pests and bugs. So today now, these communities are hold on for a while. They're hard to move communities. Communities are fairly static. Now they're at risk of flooding from climate change. Okay, and I'm trying to think. I don't quite know the setting that well for where landslides are an issue and where sort of that kind of problem would kick in. But I do know that I could give you literature about forest fires, for instance. So I know it's a problem out west.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I think often flooding and landslides go hand in hand, because you oversaturate the rock and then you have landslides. So, and I agree, a lot of the times the people living in the bottom of these valleys it was the less valuable or desired land where they're living at now.
Yeah.
I know that the earthquake hazard one, they actually did some work with providing insurance, and I'm wondering if that's an option. It wouldn't be the Forest Service option, but it might be a FEMA option to do that.
Yeah, I mean, so, and one of the things we're looking at with flooding is the buyout idea, which kind of is the counter policy to insurance, where you're going to basically help somebody make themselves whole again after something happens. An alternative to that is saying where you're living is really dangerous. Let's pay you to move out. The insurance side of it has problems just in that if there's a repetitive nature to the disaster, maybe that's not as much of an issue. With a landslide, you'll have people continually facing that same threat over and over again. The buyout side of it, economists tend to love that because it's the Coase theorem I mentioned earlier put into practice. But the problem with it is that the US has had a very bad track record in how they do those buyouts and how much they pay, because the communities tend to be undervalued real estate wise, and because there's value to community. When we're talking about some of these communities that have been there for 50 to 100 years, and you start telling people to just pick up and move, that has a cost. And this is one of the things that I learned more about talking to Kay from sociology. Economists don't spend a lot of time thinking about the value of community, but it's actually a thing, and we should. That you tear that community up when you do a buyout. And these are all relevant factors to consider. But I'm kind of deviating from your question, which was about insurance, which, aside from the fact that you don't encourage people not to live in the dangerous place, it seems like a good thing, right? But people don't always want to pay for it either. A lot of people don't pay for their flood insurance after the first year they own the house. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, I want to field one more question, and then about 20 minutes for your talk, Chris.
Okay.
So Megan, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, Chris. This
again.
actually stretches a bit from what you've just said. You've talked a lot about learning from Kay, and some of the research that you cited was interdisciplinary research. And so, as EJ research generally moves from kind of documenting disparities to trying to explain those disparities, can you comment on the potential you see for strictly disciplinary scholars to tackle some of these mechanisms? Like, do you see expertise building within economics to tackle these issues and bring expertise about housing dynamics to these questions? Or do you think the nature of environmental justice is such that we need to bring together scholars across disciplines so that economists get reminded about community and sociologists learn about housing dynamics?
Yeah. No, I think this is one of these instances where I think interdisciplinarity really has an advantage. I'm guessing, like, I know there are other areas too, not ones that I've worked in a whole lot. And sometimes I've been in interdisciplinary work where I felt like kind of it was just two groups getting tacked together and there wasn't a lot of benefit from one to the other. This is one where from the other disciplines into economics, I feel like the benefit is huge because we don't ask in economics generally the right question a lot of times. And the thing is that economists are actually, we have the ability to answer a lot of these questions really well if we realize what the question should be. We just don't think about it that way. So the other slides, the other presentation that I pulled a lot of my material from is actually called "What is EJ and Why Should Economists Care?" And I've given that talk at a number of places to all economics audiences, trying to make this exact case that we actually have really good tools to deal with this. We're just not using them in the right way. So you do actually see more economists now writing about distributive things, distributive justice, and about equity. And there was a special issue in Jerry a couple years ago now that Billy Pizer played a big role in putting together. So I do see this starting to show up now. But I do think that economists should probably listen to other disciplines more than we do, which is something as a tenured professor now, I have the luxury of saying I can do. I think that's unfortunately, it's a hard thing to do as when you're starting out. There's not much reward in the discipline for being interdisciplinary.
All right, thanks, Chris.
Thanks.
Okay, here can you see the new slides okay?
I can.
Okay, excellent. I know there's this thing with Zoom where when you're sharing full screen, if you don't exit and come back in again, it doesn't work. And I don't know, you'd think by now I would figure this out, but okay, it looks like we're there. Okay, so the focus now is going to be on one particular mechanism. And I did want to give you the sense that there are a lot of mechanisms out there that could be used to explain why we have these inequalities in the system. We could look at the way government works. We could look at intergenerational transmission of poverty. So the way that people are poor one year is going to affect the way their kids turn out, and it translates from generation to generation. So these are the things that I spend an entire semester teaching about in my undergraduate class on this. But I'm going to focus on one. And in particular, we're going to focus on housing markets. And in particular, even within that, we're going to focus on who chooses to live where. Okay. So another feature of the way housing markets work is you choose a place to live. And if you're in a group that is politically disadvantaged, if you lack the power to actually go out and express your views, the pollution you're trying to avoid may get dumped into your neighborhood. You may have very little that you can say about that. So what economists, I think, actually have some ability to speak to, because economics, I think the one thing we can bring to a lot of discussions is econometric identification. We spend a lot of time in economics talking about how to identify causal effects. So one of the problems we're looking at here is who moves in versus do poor people move into polluted neighborhoods, or does pollution move into neighborhoods of color where people are poor? Okay, and it's really hard to disentangle those two things, although there is a lot of literature that does that. And we're going to focus in particular on one of those two angles. Do people move into these poor neighborhoods? I'm sorry, do poor people move into these polluted neighborhoods? This is actually one of those stories that I think economists try to sell and try to make clear, where they maybe unjustly get a lot of pushback from the EJ community. So it's a fair thing to say that we do have disproportionate exposure because people who don't have a lot of income are choosing to live in polluted neighborhoods. And if you refuse to accept that and think that it's all the pollution being dumped on them, you're going to see a repeat of this process over and over and over again as you rezone pollution to other neighborhoods. And then all of a sudden those neighborhoods become poor because people make trade-offs. Okay, this is one of the things economics can bring to the table, is a budget constraint, and the fact that people trade off one thing for another. And if having enough to eat or providing needed medicine for your kids is a concern, you might be willing to live in a polluted neighborhood. Okay, and if we want to fix it, the big takeaway message from a lot of the stuff that I work on is we need to actually fix income inequality. So unfortunately, that's a bigger problem than the EPA can handle. I'm not sure the federal government has a good handle on it in general, but income inequality is underlying all of this. Okay, I'm going to skip over a lot of detail here, but I left it in, Marty, just in case anybody asked a question at the end of this that I could always come back and talk about. But I'm going to jump up to just sort of say the economics way of treating housing markets is essentially summed up in the following. This is why it's an EJ topic. Basically, the price differential between a non-polluted and a polluted neighborhood is being set by the majority. Okay, there's somebody in the majority who has to be indifferent between living in the polluted and the non-polluted neighborhood in order for us to have housing market equilibrium. Now, the majority, just the way we define income inequality and poverty, the majority tends to be reasonably well off, at least middle income or high income. Poverty is generally defined at about 30% of the population. And minorities are, the definition of being a minority is not being in the majority. So you're in a group that's maybe not getting to make the decision. So if the trade-off between polluted and clean neighborhood is being defined by the rich person or the white person, it's going to make that clean neighborhood more expensive. Okay, what I just went through in all those graphs that I didn't stop on is a way of describing through economic sorting models why poorer people, who are going to be probably correlated with being people of color in our income distribution, are going to choose to live in the polluted neighborhood. It's going to give them greater utility because the trade-off that they're being asked to make to live in the clean neighborhood is too great. Okay. I think it's important to recognize that because this has to be part of the story. And I'm not saying it because in the end, we should therefore ignore disproportionate exposures to pollution, but I'm saying this as a call to actually worry more about the income inequality that leads people to make these decisions. Okay, so that being said, I think economists then tend to say, well, we've covered housing markets, now we're done. But I want to say, hold on a second. We have a history in the US of the way we treat housing markets that means that these markets don't work nearly as cleanly as the graphs that I just skipped through would suggest. Okay, the way that all that economic theory works, there's a lot of wrenches thrown in there. So in particular, I'm just going to summarize the way that the markets fail in the US under the banner of discrimination. And I'm going to do two things here really quickly. I'll keep an eye on the clock. One is to give you a very, very brief historical context in the US. And this is the systemic part of the racism and the environmental racism, environmental injustice. And then to come to some very current stuff and talk to you for 5 minutes about a project that we're currently working on that looks at discrimination in rental markets in the US today or last summer. Okay, so in the historical context, the things that we're interested in here go back more than 100 years to the early 20th century with ideas around racial zoning, but then intimidation, You can think about bombings and various other kinds of things that white supremacy has initiated in neighborhoods of color. Restrictive covenants, which are surprisingly even still around today, and I'll show you some examples of that. Redlining, which I think is something people have heard about quite a bit. It seems like it's making a comeback in research right now. Exclusionary and expulsive zoning. Okay, and I'll kind of tie those together. So I'm only going to spend a second on each one of these, but I would encourage you during questions, I'll leave these notes open. I'm happy to come back and talk more about any of them. Racial zoning was the actual implementation of a zoning rule saying you can't live in this block based on the color of your skin. These things came around in the early 20th century, mostly as a response to the Great Migration, where cities were starting to see large influxes of African Americans moving in from the South, putting a lot of pressure on house prices, and the response of that in the real estate markets there was to push for rules saying there's only certain parts of town where you can live. Okay, that actually, I think this is something people don't often think, but that actually led to much higher house prices in Black neighborhoods in most cities in the US in the early part of the 20th centuries, because they were so restricted in where they could possibly choose to live. So if you could find a house to live in and you're African American, you would pay a significant premium over the same house in a white neighborhood. And there's a lot of interesting evidence on that. Here's one quote. This is a quote from the mayor of Baltimore, I think back in the 1910s. So it's pretty old now, but this summarizes, I think, where the racial zoning came from. So Blacks should be quarantined to live in isolated slums in order to reduce incidents of civil disturbance, prevent spread of communicable disease into white neighborhoods. This is what people were talking about with respect to racial zoning. Fortunately, I guess, these things actually did get taken up by courts and struck down. Not struck down because they were necessarily racist, but struck down because they could be shown to actually take people's property, which is unconstitutional. Okay, so the government can't come in if you're living in a neighborhood where they say you can't live anymore and take away your house and say you have to move. So pretty much all of these got struck down by the middle of the century, but they got replaced by things like walls. Here's a picture of the Peyton Wall in Atlanta and the Coconut Grove Wall in Miami. These weren't walls that actually kept people from moving, but they created a visual and a mental barrier to space to say you're not welcome on this side of the street. Okay, and they would also prevent traffic flow once cars started to really matter. Real estate got heavily involved in this. The real estate industry, real estate boards wrote a lot of really difficult things to read now when you go back and read them from the 40s and 50s. You had just outright white supremacy playing a role. And that ties in with other forms of intimidation and bombings in particular. You had interstate highway construction. So urban renewal is kind of a loaded term in a lot of these cases, where you see this in Durham, where the Hayti district was basically now where the Durham freeway goes past the Durham Bulls ballpark and down towards RTI. Okay, that used to be the Hayti district, but these are the areas that, because of redlining, were very inexpensive and could be bought up and replaced with infrastructure because they were underdeveloped for reasons I'll come to really briefly later. Okay, I'm going to skip through a lot of the detail here to make sure I have some time to talk about current things. Restrictive covenants were just voluntary agreements. I just want to show this. This is an actual quote from a restrictive covenant from a community in Charlotte that was uncovered in 2009. Okay, making specific reference to the fact that you had to be Caucasian to buy the house there. It's unclear just how enforced these things were, but nobody ever bothered to take them out of the deeds. Okay, Grosse Pointe in Michigan had a really interesting setup where to buy a house there, you actually had to go through a point system with the real estate brokers, where you would get different amounts of points for being from different race groups. And so if you were Black, Asian, or Mexican, there was no amount of points you could have gotten. You got 50 points if you were Northern European, 55. So basically, if you were Jewish, you had to get up to 85 points to live there, and you would get points for having, club membership and things like that. So these things got very explicit. You could go find lots of written documentation. Here's some quotes from real estate brokers and broker associations that talk about basically not allowing neighborhoods to flip. let me kind of skip up a little bit. Exclusionary zoning, really important to think about, because as environmental researchers and environmental economists, in my case, a lot of the things we look at here are actually zoning rules that we think of as possibly being good. Okay, things like smart growth and open space preservation are oftentimes, if you go and look at why they're being implemented, they're actually there to prevent housing construction that could allow for a broader range of people to move in. Okay, so that's kind of a fraught area to dig into. Redlining, this was actually a program created in the 30s to try to help people keep their houses during, the redlining part was not specifically that, but the loan corporation was set up to help people keep their homes. The loan corporation created a system for how to evaluate how loan worthy locations were, so that the federal government wouldn't make loans to bad places that would cost them their loans. Those categories basically broke down into white and Jewish, white with moving towards black, and then all black neighborhoods. And all black neighborhoods were the ones designated as red on the maps. That's where the term comes from. So here's Durham's redlining map. You can see the green area, which is, this is a direct quote from the HOLC information about Durham. And you can see it points out that there's faculty, college professors living there. I guess they earned a pretty good living back in the 1940s. But it basically says this is a safe place to invest. Then you go across the street to East Durham, and you see that we have a much higher percentage of African Americans here. The income is a lot lower. The neighborhood, formerly a good white residential street, but Negroes are gradually taking up the area. This is the official document, okay? This is not a paraphrase. This is what was handed out to realtors. This is how they made loans. So these areas didn't get loans, which meant all of the housing there got underinvested in, fell apart, turned into slums, what was later officially called a slum, which then made it a lot easier to go in and tear it down and build a highway through it, because urban renewal of slums, it's all connected, okay? It also led to vast disparities in wealth today, okay? Because owning a house in the 40s, which was also prevented by deeds in certain communities like Levittown, PA, where the Veterans Administration didn't make loans to veterans coming back from World War II if they weren't white. All these barriers kept people from buying houses that then they could sell at a higher price, buy another house, sell that at a higher price, put their kids through college with all of that wealth that they've built up, live in clean neighborhoods today. A lot of the disparities we see today are because of this wealth ladder. Okay, so I'm going to now jump very quickly, because I think I have about maybe 4 minutes, to the present day. Okay. And in particular, do we think that this has all gone away? So I have one picture here of Lyndon Johnson signing the Fair Housing Act, part of the Civil Rights Acts of the mid 60s, which we, supposedly fixed the problems that we're talking about. I'm going to skip talking about this study. This is done with federal data, an audit study, and jump to our work, because I'll just promote my own stuff more here, where we look at rental markets. And in particular, what's the discrimination that occurs on a major online real estate platform? So if you've rented an apartment online, or you've just gone to look around and play around on one of those online websites, how rampant is discrimination there? Okay. What we do is we run a correspondence study. So a correspondence study is basically a computer sitting in the basement of a building at the University of Illinois, where my co-author is, who that computer sends out inquiries to apartments to look at them, okay? It does so using names that the sociology literature, something else I've learned quite a bit about here from them, is these names have been racialized. So these names have a very strong racial component. We're publishing this work now, so I can show you the names. They're no longer a secret. We have African-American names, Latinx names, and white names. And I can talk more about how you racialize names later. And we send out inquiries from these names to apartments in a variety of different settings. I'll just say that. And I'll show you one setting where we focus on exposure to pollution as a result of discrimination, okay? Every unit that we have out there gets 3 inquiries, 1 from each race group, but they could vary by the gender or by the mother's education level, which is also embedded in those names. Again, more detail than I'll go into right now, but lots of randomization about who gets the call when, which name comes first, what's the timing between them. The bot is very good at fooling landlords. Let's just put it that way. What we do is we look in this particular setting at a bunch of different zip codes within the US that have high levels of toxicity in them based on exposure to TRI facilities, the toxic release inventory. Okay. So what we're going to do, here's two different zip codes, and zip codes have funny shapes, which is kind of why they look like this. The blue diamonds are toxic release inventory plants. The shading here indicates using the RISI risk screening environmental indicators data I mentioned earlier. This is basically an air mod that describes how much of the pollution from these plants ends up in each one of these squares. It's a really great data set to study local pollution. So then what we're going to do is we're going to look at apartments that are for rent in the parts of the zip code that are heavily and not heavily exposed to the TRI pollution. And we're going to see if there's a disproportionate rate of response where Black names versus Latinx names versus white names get different responses based upon how polluted the neighborhood is. So I can jump really just straight to the result. I apologize, this is kind of blurry. So you kind of have to squint a little to see the all of the writing. But the basic idea here is that 75 to 100% is the dirtiest part of the zip code. 0 to 25% is the cleanest part. So we rank parts of the zip code based upon their quantile, their percentile in the pollution distribution. And the way to interpret this is in the clean places, if you're Black or Latinx, you get a response when the white renter gets a response 60% of the time. Okay, so every time a white renter gets a response, the Black or the Latinx renter gets a response 60% of the time. In the dirtiest places, the Black and Latinx renters actually get more responses than the white renters do. Okay, and if you focus on particular race groups, things are actually much, much worse for African Americans. In the cleanest neighborhoods, if you're African American, you get a response about 45% of the time that a white renter does. Okay, and we see this same thing in other settings. I'll just point out in Philadelphia, in a different sampling frame, the response for Black renters when white renters get a response is about 35%. That's the lowest percent response we found in any of the cities we've looked at in the US. I think I have those results later on here. It's a different study and I won't try to explain two different ones at once. I'll just stop here with the toxics analysis and take questions. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, we have one question from Madhu Sudan. Give me 1 second. I need to allow you to unmute yourself. Okay, Madhu Sudan, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, yeah, this was interesting. And I was just wondering, you started with the economist models and how, you can see evidence of discrimination in policies in the US, but is there anywhere in the world that the housing markets actually work the way the models suggest?
Probably not. Simplest answer is no. The typical economist answer is that our model is the simplest, it's a simplification of reality that we argue doesn't get rid of anything really important, but distills the market down to the thing we really care about so that we can then draw inference about that thing. My argument here would be we're throwing out something really important when we say the market works perfectly. But I think for a long time, the argument was, and probably still is in most settings, that people are going to make the argument that no, the market works great. And if anything, the argument has been in the online setting, the market works even better, right? Because now we have very little in terms of barriers to search, the standard kinds of arguments. But what we're finding is that on the online setting, if you have to put your name in, it's as bad as it could ever have been, right?
Even Airbnb shows that, right?
Airbnb shows, basically the same thing in a different housing setting. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, Chris, I'm going to let questions trickle in on your housing market talk. Oh, wait, we've got one. Okay. Anne, can you unmute yourself?
I was just wondering about this graph or these two plots, if you drew any conclusions about the differences between African American and Latinx.
Yeah, I mean, given the sample that we looked at, we tried to make it very random for communities across the United States. So to that extent, to the extent that we successfully randomized communities, you could argue that the discrimination is worse for African American communities. But the point, I think, is that it's very different in different places. So Philadelphia, it's extremely bad for the African American community, but in Atlanta, it actually, we've done work there, it's not actually so bad. You go to, for instance, San Jose, we've looked there, and there the Latinx community actually does really well. But you go to Cleveland, and the Latinx community does really badly. Okay, so in general, it's very community specific, and I kind of have in the back of my mind, like, we haven't tested this formally, although we're working on something that will let us test this more formally, that there are some historical components, right? If you're in a community where the African American community is really important in the business world, and there's been African American mayors of the town, I mean, maybe that makes things better. And if you're looking at a community where the Latinx community plays a big role in governance, maybe that improves things. But I don't know that we have enough data to formally like look for covariates to say when one is worse than the other. It's very anecdotal at this stage.
Okay, I had a direct question. How do we eventually disentangle housing market discrimination from overarching effects of income inequality on sorting to prioritize, e.g. interventions?
Yeah, so this is basically one of the next treatment arms that we're working on. So, you know, a treatment arm here would be adjusting the email that gets sent to the landlord to give them more information. So one thing we could do would be you're allowed to put more into the email. Right now, we just sort of use the template. So the name goes through and that's it. We could put in occupation. We could put in information about income more directly, right? Maybe we want to put in something about occupation because income might be a little too direct and make the landlord a little suspicious. But we could take two individuals who we're going to hypothetically give the exact same income and ask, does that fix the problem, right? If you're Black, are you just as likely to get a response? If we say you're a doctor as the white renter who says he's a doctor, or does it not matter at all, right? That's the easiest way to think about teasing those two things apart. To do that, we just need to send out another 100,000 inquiries to landlords all around the country and keep the bot cranking away. The costly part of doing this is that we were not able to machine read the responses. The responses come back in emails that are hard to interpret or in phone calls on burner. We have to pay undergrads to listen to those and to interpret the emails. That's the main cost to doing this. If AI could do it for us, we'd have these treatment arms done in like a week or less.
Yeah, that's a lot of work.
Yeah, tedious too, if you ask the undergrads.
Laura, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sure. I think you partially just answered it, but you talked about income disparity as underlying so much of the discrimination in the real estate market. And I was just curious as to your intuition in terms of how much that plays into what you're seeing in the rental market, which is really astounding to see. Yeah, I mean, so I do think that there is an element to this because we've talked to realtors. We've talked to business school people who work with realtors all the time, and they'll tell us that, you know, this isn't really discrimination because all it is the realtor making an inference about what somebody's income is. And given that they have a lower income, their inference is that their income is lower, they're not going to want to live in this neighborhood, or they're not going to be able to eventually pass the credit report stage, right? The HUD study that I skipped, the earlier one, actually, so we work with their data, the government data. They actually run an audit study where people come in with income credentials. It's actors showing up in real estate offices.
And there we find really strong evidence where two individuals are explicitly have the exact same income, and we still see evidence that the Black or the Latinx buyer is not shown as many houses or is shown houses in lower quality neighborhoods. So there's definitely a racial element to it, aside from income. But what real estate agents would tell us is something like, well, that person's not going to like that neighborhood in the end, which is just a codified way of saying, right? I mean, it's a racial statement, or that maybe they don't trust their income. These are basically statements that could qualify as statistical discrimination. There's a distinction there where statistical discrimination is you make inferences about people based on the distribution of the population that they come from. Which, by the way, the problem with that is that argument is that statistical discrimination is also illegal under the Fair Housing Act. So I've had business school people who work with real estate agents, and I've had real estate agents tell me, okay, it's just statistical discrimination. And then I have to remind them that that's actually a problem. That's not an answer they want to give, but still, yeah. But yeah, there's different ways to sort of break the discrimination up, and it may not actually be animus or just, wanting to hurt people. It could be something that in your mind you could rationalize as being well-intentioned, and maybe in a way, but it's not. It's a problem.
Well, really important work. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you.
Sharing it. Yeah.
Okay, we're out of time. Sorry, Dylan, and anybody else whose questions we didn't have time for. Maybe we can follow up with Chris. And Chris, thanks for talking for a full hour and 15 minutes.
It probably goes very fast. We could have talked for longer. No, I'm happy if anybody ever wants, if you have a question that you really wanted to ask, feel free to email me. I'm happy to respond. I can provide sites. I can answer questions about what I showed here. Any of that's fine.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Chris. And thank you everyone for coming. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And just to remind you all, in 2 weeks, we will continue the discussion of environmental justice for anyone who joined late today. Thanks, Chris.
Great. Thank you, Marty. Thanks,
and
everybody.
Thank you, Marty, for organizing, and Brad as well. Yeah. Thanks.